Hello, and thank you for joining me here today at Why the Book Wins, where I compare books with their movie adaptations. My name is Laura, and today I am talking about No Country for Old Men by Cormac McCarthy, published in 2005, and I am comparing it with the movie adaptation directed by Joel and Ethan Coen, which was released soon after in 2007. And now this was requested by Dave, so Dave, thank you for reaching out to me. But it was also on a YouTube poll. So because Dave requested this, and because it has, of course, been on my radar, I put it on a YouTube poll last month and it won the poll. So definitely subscribe to my channel and you can take part in future Book First Movie polls. I do them about every other month. And if you sign up on Patreon, you can take part in even more polls. So I do them every other month on Patreon and about every other month on YouTube. So if you're a Patreon member, you get to be voting every single month on what my content is. So yeah, thank you to all of my subscribers who voted, and thank you for Dave for reaching out and requesting this. And this is my second Cormac McCarthy Book First Movie episode. Last year I did The Road, so I will link to that if you want to check it out. And then also, No Country was up against There Will Be Blood in the 2008 Oscars. And they were filmed at the same time, and part of their filming, they were even in the same locations in Texas. And there's the story about how No Country had to shut down filming because an oil explosion scene was getting in their shot in the distance from There Will Be Blood. And There Will Be Blood was actually also based on a book, Oil by Upton Sinclair. And I did a Book First movie for this back in 2020. This was a very early episode I did. So I will link to that. It is only available as a podcast, and we only have the audio because it was before I started a YouTube channel. I thought of refilming that one so I can have an actual YouTube video for it. So maybe I'll do that in the future. And I do love There Will Be Blood. It is fantastic. So good. And as far as, the Oscars go, No Country ended up winning Best Picture. But personally, I prefer There Will Be Blood. And I like No Country, so it's not like I'm upset that I ended up winning. But as far as the two movies go, I'm a There Will Be Blood person. That movie is just a masterpiece in my mind, which No Country, a lot of people consider this a masterpiece as well. So you're really comparing two incredible movies at the end of the day. But regardless, if you want to check out There Will Be Blood or my Road Book First movie, I will link to both of them. But onto the book review for No Country for Old Men. So like I said, I read The Road last year. And that book I was kind of disappointed by. It just has so much hype around it. So many people love The Road and they're obsessed with it. And so when I read the book, I was just kind of yeah, I like it and it's good, but I just didn't understand why people love it so much. And so I went into No Country feeling a bit wary based on that experience and just kind of assuming it might be similar, where I end up finding the book a bit overrated. However, I am happy to say that I loved this book so much. It was so fantastic. Each chapter begins with Sheriff Bell sharing a story from his life and just his thoughts on the world. And so we get that right in the opening section. And right from the start, I was just hooked. And Cormac McCarthy, based on the two books I've read, his writing can come across as pretty sparse, but that doesn't mean it's not well written, because I found this book so atmospheric and so engaging, and it has a lot of symbolism, and it just gives you so much to think about. And there is a dream described at the very end of this book. And throughout this book, even though I was loving it, I never felt emotional. But then as this dream is told to us at the end, by the time I finished the book, I suddenly felt like I was going to cry, which caught me off guard, because I was whoa, the emotion just snuck up on me, I guess. So yeah, I absolutely love this book and I would highly recommend it. And the narrator for the audiobook is fantastic, and it is the same narrator who has narrated two other of my favorite books, That Is Sometimes a Great Notion by Ken Kesey and Joe by Larry Brown, which, by the way, Joe the movie from 2013 starring Nicolas Cage, such an underrated movie. Please go watch that movie. It is fantastic. And then after you've watched it, you should watch my Book First movie episode that I have for it, because the book is fantastic too. But anyway, so he narrated Sometimes a Great Notion, Joe, and No Country for Old Men, and he is a fantastic narrator. So if you choose to listen to this book, or any of the books I just listed, you are in for a treat, because he does such a great job. But I would recommend, if you're listening to the audiobook for Sometimes a Great Notion or No Country for Old Men, I think you should go back and forth between listening and reading, because both of those books are just the way they're written is so unique. And so there is something about actually physically reading it. And you just miss out on that by only listening to it, And on to the movie review. So I did see this movie around the time it came out. I did not see this or There Will Be Blood in theaters, which I will forever regret, because seeing either of these movies on the big screen, like, oh man, that must have been such a great experience. If you saw either of those in theaters, please comment down below how fantastic it must have been. I'm so jealous, especially There Will Be Blood. Like, I wish a theater would like replay that or whatever, you know, how they do like a special screening, like this weekend only. I wish they would do that for one of these movies. But anyway, so yeah, I had not seen it since then, I don't think. And even though I remembered like some of the bigger moments and like the premise of it for the most part I remembered, but there were a lot of details that I had forgotten about. And I saw a Letterboxd review where a person described this movie as being very calm despite the violence. And I thought that was such a great point, right? And they specifically mentioned the very first scene in the movie, we see Chigurh kill someone, but it's like the way it's done, like Chigurh is so calm and there's like no music adding to the tense atmosphere. And so, yeah, there is like a calmness to this movie. And I loved the lack of soundtrack. Like there is very minimal music going on here. And it just really adds to the tone and the atmosphere. And there are multiple scenes where two characters are talking to each other and you feel like you're just holding your breath because the scene is so tense, but it's also just so quiet, like you could hear a pin drop, you know? And so I loved the lack of music. And the acting is of course superb, and Javier Bardem won an Oscar for his performance as Anton Chigurh, who of course is like a psychopathic killer. And was like some study done where like different psychiatrists watch 400 different movies that have a character who is a psychopath, and they decided that Anton Chigurh was the most accurate representation of one. So that's kind of interesting. But to be honest, like I'm kind of tired of the psychopathic killer trope we see so often in books and movies. I just think it's overdone and I just do not find it interesting. The only exception as of late being Gone Girl, which I think actually did it in a unique way that was very different. But for the most part, I'm just kind of over it. But even so, Bardem is incredible here, and his character was also very well written in the book as well. And then I have to mention Roger Deakins, who also won an Oscar for his cinematography in this movie, and he's a cinematographer I have mentioned before for Shawshank Redemption. I don't know if I've mentioned him any other time, but he's like one of the most famous cinematographers out there. So I just wanted to mention that he did the cinematography for this movie as well. But from here on out, I'm going to be getting into the details of the book and movie, which means from here on out, we will be getting into spoilers. So to start, I'm just going to go over the basic plot real quick, just so we can get that out of the way, and then I'm going to talk about the characters. So Llewelyn Moss is out hunting when he comes across a drug deal gone wrong, where like everybody ended up shooting each other. And so he finds the money that had been involved and he takes it, and like some of the other people find out who he is and that he has the money, and so he has to go on the run to get away. And one of the guys looking for him is a man named Anton Chigurh, who was hired by one of the, by the big wigs who were behind this whole drug deal, and so they hire him to get the money back. And then we have Sheriff Bell, who is this older, old-timer sheriff who is trying to find Chigurh and Moss. He's trying to find Moss to help protect him because, he has these people on his tail. But he's also trying to find Chigurh because Chigurh, is leaving dead bodies in his path. And so they want to find him. But by the end of the movie, Moss ends up being killed, not by Chigurh, but by just some Mexicans who had been involved with the drug deal. And then Chigurh just gets away, and Bell, feeling defeated, ends up retiring. And that is the basic premise. So I'm going to start talking about Anton Chigurh first. And so you can see each of these three main characters as representing something. And I feel like there's a number of ways you could interpret this book and movie, really. But I'm going to look at this as Chigurh representing fate and the world in general, and also just evil. And there are multiple scenes where he has people flip a coin and they call it, and depending on if they're right or wrong about it being heads or tails, that is how he determines if he will kill them or not. And he also kills out of principle, and we have this character who I'm not gonna get into really, but Carson Wells. And Carson Wells says of Chigurh, "You can't make a deal with him. Even if you gave him the money, he'd still kill you just for inconveniencing him. He's a peculiar man. You might even say that he has principles. Principles that transcend money or drugs or anything like that. He's not like you, and he's not even like me." And by the way, so much of this movie, the dialogue, is taken verbatim from the book. So I always love it when a movie does that. Not all dialogue transitions well into film, but the dialogue in this book definitely did, and so much of it is right there in the movie. But anyway, so when Chigurh is looking for Moss, he tells Moss that if he surrenders himself, he will not kill Moss's wife, Carla Jean. But Moss thinks he can defeat Chigurh, and so he doesn't sacrifice himself. And so when Moss dies, Chigurh goes to see Carla Jean to kill her, and he tells her, I have to kill you because I promised your husband. But Carla Jean is no, you don't. You don't have to do this. And I had nothing to do with any of this. And Moss is dead. He won't know if you keep your promise or not. But because Chigurh lives by, those principles, he acts like he has no choice. And it's sorry, I just have to kill you. But he must end up feeling bad for her to some extent. Or maybe not feeling bad for her, but he sees the logic in her part being like, I had nothing to do with this, so why should you kill me? Because then he offers her like, okay, the best I can do is I can flip this coin, and if you call it right, then I won't shoot you. And when he does this, again, he's acting like he doesn't have a choice in the matter, right? Because he's just like, I won't make the choice. It'll be on the coin. And just like, he's almost like, I don't have a choice in being here at all. Like, I just have to as a matter of principle. And so it is interesting how he acts like it's not on him. It's just about the principles of life, or it's about the fate of this coin. And Carla Jean kind of calls him out on that, being like, no, like you have a choice. Like you're choosing to be here. Don't act like it's out of your control. But in the book, she does end up calling it, like I think she calls tails, but it ends up being heads. And so she dies. Whereas the movie we cut out. And so we don't see if she calls it or not, but we can assume that he does kill her. And then something we don't see in the movie. So in book and movie, it starts out with Chigurh being arrested, and then he kills the cop that had arrested him, and then he gets away. But in the book, we learn why he was arrested, and it's because he was at a diner, and some guy in the diner was like saying something about him, and Chigurh, after a few times, Chigurh basically tells him like, let's take this outside. And once they go outside, he ends up killing the guy. And then he knows the cop is going to come and arrest him, but he chooses to allow himself to be arrested because he's like, let's see if I can escape, and let's see if I can get out of this, which of course he does. And then on to Llewelyn Moss. So Chigurh represents like fate and the evil of the world that we can't stop. And then Moss represents the everyman that is like subjected to this fate. And it's interesting because, so Moss takes the money first and then he goes home. And then later that night, he's thinking about a guy who had been there who was like still alive and he needed water. And Moss feels bad about leaving him. So then he goes back to give this guy water. And when he goes back to do something nice is when other people show up and they find out who he is and that he has the money. So if he hadn't been kind, he probably would have been fine. Like assuming he found the tracker, because there's a tracker inside the briefcase thing. So as long as he found that in time, he would have gotten away with it and no one would have known, right? But because he's nice and is trying to help other people, that is what does him in. And it kind of reminds me of another scene, which this might have been specific to the movie, because there's a part in the movie where Llewelyn is crossing the border into Mexico and he sees these guys and he asks if he can buy one of their jackets. And this scene, he goes to Mexico in the book, but I don't remember him interacting with these college kids to get their jacket. Correct me if I'm wrong. But anyway, so he's trying to get their jacket and the guys are just kind of being jerks to him, but he does get the jacket in the end. And then parallel to that, we have a scene at the end of the book and movie where Chigurh is injured and he tries to get the shirt from these kids and the kids are very nice and very accommodating. And so it's interesting because Moss, who is the good guy, is stuck with these guys who are jerks, whereas Chigurh, who is the bad guy, has these kids who are super accommodating and nice, right? But one scene that I really liked that was not in the movie at all is where Moss is driving and he picks up a hitchhiker and she looks like she's about 15 years old and she talks about how she's going to California to like start over basically. And Moss tries to explain to her how you can't just go to a new location and start over. Like that doesn't work. And we read, it's not about knowing where you are. It's about thinking you got there without taking anything with you. Your notions about starting over, or anybody's, you don't start over. That's what it's about. Every step you take is forever. You can't make it go away. None of it. You understand what I'm saying? I know you don't, but let me try one more time. You think when you wake up in the morning, yesterday don't count, but yesterday is all that does count. What else is there? Your life is made out of the days it's made out of, nothing else. You might think you can run away and change your name and I don't know what all, start over. And then one morning you wake up and look at the ceiling and guess who's laying there? And yeah, I love this part so much and how like, you can't just start over and start fresh as if the past didn't happen, right? Like, and it actually makes me think of, for example, like the AA 12 steps, right? Because that's a way where you can start fresh in a way, but the only way you can start fresh is by addressing your past and addressing the things that you did yesterday, And so you can't just start fresh by just moving somewhere new and acting like the past didn't happen because the past is who you are, right? Again, that was just one of those sections that I just thought was really thought-provoking, and that is not in the movie at all. But eventually, he and this girl are on their way to El Paso when the other people show up and end up shooting both of them. And in the movie, this is different because in the movie, he arrives in El Paso and he's waiting for Carla Jean when he meets this woman at a motel and she offers him some beer. And in both, he doesn't cheat on Carla Jean. He's like, hey, I'm a married man. But in the movie, he drinks some beer with this lady. And then this lady and he are the ones who end up getting shot. But his death, like we don't see his death firsthand in either book or movie, which is so interesting. And in some ways, it almost makes it seem like either one, his death was so insignificant in a way that he wasn't even granted a death scene. But you could also see it in like a fatalist mindset where like his fate, he was always going to die that way, right? And that was his fate. And because it was a given, it therefore wasn't even worth showing because that was just always what was going to happen. You could see this as being a very fatalistic mindset throughout this movie and even nihilistic to some degree. And then to move on to Sheriff Ed Tom Bell. So Bell represents the good and the world, and he is the protagonist to Anton's antagonist. And also their names are interesting too. So Chigurh's name sounds very much like sugar, and sugar is sweet, but obviously Chigurh is not sweet. But it's also a deceiving name, right? Because it sounds like sugar, but it's not. And so just the deception and something not being what it seems is interesting. And then you have Bell, and bells you think of as like clarity and truth, right? And so it makes sense that Bell is like the good guy of this movie. And then you have Llewelyn Moss, which his name, it's harder to think of what the symbolism is there, but moss is just like this very run-of-the-mill common thing that grows everywhere, and it's just very common, right? And seeing moss as representing the everyman, it makes sense that he's named after a very common plant. Maybe that's a stretch, but I just thought it was interesting thinking of their names. Anyway, so Bell reflects on his own life throughout this book, and he starts to feel like he just doesn't belong in this changing world because, like I said, he is older. And near the end of the book, he starts to doubt the things that he had thought was true. And he says, I feel like them old people I was talking about, which ain't going to get better neither. I'm being asked to stand for something that I don't have the same belief in I once did. Asked to believe in something I might not hold with the way I once did. That's the problem, and I failed at it even when I did. The other thing is the old people, and I keep coming back to them. They look at me and it's always a question. Years back, I don't remember that. I don't remember it when I was a sheriff back in the 50s. You see them and they don't even look confused. They just look crazy. That bothers me. It's like they woke up and don't know how they got where they're at. Well, in a manner of speaking, they don't. I thought this was really interesting too, like getting older and seeing the world change around you and feeling that disconnect from the change that's happening. And I know being in my early 30s does not make me old, so I'm not trying to act like I'm like so old and wise or something. But I will say being in my 30s has definitely been weird because for the first time, like I'm starting to understand why older people do like complain about the world changing. Because, for example, the other day I went to this cafe that I used to go to all the time in my like early mid 20s. I used to go all the time. And I went there recently and the whole layout had changed. Plus they now have like an iPad where you put your order in without even talking to a cashier. And the changes to that cafe like suddenly just made me so sad. And it's not because, I'm against technology, right? But it's just because that cafe like represented part of my past because I went there like almost every day. And so the fact that it changed now makes me feel more disconnected from it. And therefore it makes me feel more disconnected from my past self. And so as I've gotten older, my past self just keeps getting further and further away, So it's like when a friend moves one state over and then they move 2 states over. And then before you know it, they live across the country. And so I've just like been missing my past self. And then when things that make me feel connected to my past change, I just feel that disconnect even more. And so I used to think it was so annoying when older people complained about change being like, oh, they just don't like progress or something. But I don't think that's it. I mean, it could be it to some extent, but I think ultimately, like for me at least, feeling sadness about change isn't because I'm against it all the time, but it's because it makes me feel more and more distant from my past self. And if our past is who we are, then it therefore is making me feel more disconnected from myself in a way, right? And so because I've already just been feeling this, and just time has gone so quickly ever since I graduated high school. And so there's that too, where things from my past, when I realized like, wow, that was like, 15 years ago now, it just makes me feel this sadness, in part because I know that the rest of my life is just going to go by so quickly, but also because, again, just feeling that distance from my past. Anyway, I hope that made some sense. But this book definitely had me thinking more about those things that I had already been thinking about to begin with. But anyway, back to No Country. So something we find out about Bell in the book that is not in the movie is that he is a decorated war hero, but when he talks to Ellis, who is his uncle, the movie doesn't say it's his uncle, but in the book, it's like his uncle. Anyway, he's talking to Ellis in the book, and he tells him about how he got a medal for surviving an attack in World War II, but he confesses, like, I didn't survive that attack. I actually ran away, and that's why I didn't die. And after he heard he was going to be awarded a medal, he went and he told the guy in charge, being like, this is what really happened. I don't deserve this medal. But the guy in charge basically tells him, like, never tell that to anybody else. You're going to accept this medal, and that's that. And so it's interesting because this could be an example of how, like, some of the lies that our country is built on, in a sense. And Bell also, like, he is constantly thinking how the past was better, but this is an example of how if the past is full of lies, it must not have been as good as he thought it was, right? But when Bell, he tells Ellis about this story about the war, and then he tells him, some part of me has never quit wishing I could go back, and I can't. I didn't know you could steal your own life, and I didn't know that it would bring you no more benefit than anything else you might steal. I think I'd done the best with what I knew how, but it still wasn't mine. It never has been. And again, wow, like, just so beautiful and thought-provoking. And of course, talking about how, like, he stole his own life and how stealing your own life, it benefits you as much as anything else you steal, which is, it actually hurts you. And obviously we have Moss, who stole that money early on, and it ruins his life, and he dies and his wife dies, you know? So yeah, just really interesting. And again, just so thought-provoking. And yeah, that whole war story is not in the movie at all. We do have Ellis, and Ellis does talk about the past and how maybe it wasn't quite what Belle thinks it was. So it's similar, but not quite the same. But another scene I wanted to talk about, again, I do not remember this in the book. Again, I could be wrong, but comment down below if this was in the book, but I don't think it was, where after Moss's death, he is shot in a motel. And afterwards, you know, it's all taped up with the crime scene tape. And Belle goes back there that evening to see if Chigurh happens to be there. And there are 2 rooms that are blocked off. And Belle goes inside one, but Chigurh is in the other. And so because he goes in the room without Chigurh, nothing happens. And it's a tense moment. You know, he has his gun drawn while he's in there. And then he sees it's empty, and then he just kind of sits, and that's that. And so it's such an interesting scene because, for one, you know, we have the coin toss, which is very, like, you know, choosing 2 sides of a coin, and one you win and one you lose. And Belle has to choose between these 2 rooms. So like fate in a way. And he chooses the wrong room. But it's also so interesting because it's this anti-climax, right? Like, you expect the antagonist and the protagonist to have this final shootout. And stereotypically, the good guy is going to end up winning, right? And so we're waiting for that scene. And even me, who read the book and who has seen this movie before, I didn't remember this part. And so part of me was like, oh, like, is there going to be some kind of something happening? But then it doesn't. And so I just thought it was such a great scene and so well done. And it could be an example, again, going back to fate, about how you can't stop fate. And so Belle, he never has that interaction with Chigurh because ultimately you just can't stop what's going to happen anyway. And this movie is also considered a modern Western. And it's so well done because it takes so many of those old Western tropes and it just turns them on their head. And you end up getting like the opposite of what you expect. And the anti-climax scene right there is just the perfect example of that. But another thing from the book that we do not see in the movie is that, so at the end, which I didn't mention this, but Chigurh, he's driving away at the end and he gets hit by a car and he's injured, but then he gets away ultimately. And after this car crash happens, Belle continues searching for Chigurh and he interrogates like the 2 kids who gave Chigurh their shirt. And so he stays on his trail for a while, but ultimately it's to no avail and he just feels defeated and he retires. Whereas in the movie, we don't see him continuing the search like that. But I did want to talk about Belle's dream. So in book and movie, this is like verbatim. He shares 2 dreams with his wife. And so the first dream, both of them involve his dad who passed away. And his dad passed away when he was younger than Belle is now. So when Belle thinks about his dad, he's thinking about a man who's younger than himself, which again is just so interesting. But anyway, so this first dream, he says that his dad gives him some money, but then he like lost the money. In this dream, he just kind of like mentions, and it clearly didn't make a big impact on him. He's just like, oh yeah, this was the first dream. And so this dream could represent his guilt over the death of Moss and Carla Jean, because he promised Carla Jean that he would, you know, do his best to protect them and protect her and Moss. But then the fact that they both ended up dying, like he has like some subconscious guilt that maybe he doesn't even realize. And that's why the dream is just kind of mentioned in passing, because maybe he doesn't even realize the guilt he still holds over that, potentially. Which, by the way, if you have other thoughts on what these dreams represent, I would love to hear them. So please comment down below. I think symbolism and discussing it is just so fascinating. And so I love books that have a lot of symbolism and that don't lay it out for you, because then you can just be discussing it indefinitely, right? If there's no concrete answer, you can just be forever discussing it. So anyway, share your thoughts down below in the comments on what you think these dreams mean. But anyway, the second dream, he is with his father and they're out riding and it's dark and it's cold and it's barren and his father is like all bundled up and he's carrying a horn of fire. And Belle says, "And in that dream, I knew that he was going on ahead and that he was fixing to make a fire somewhere out there in all that dark and all that cold. And I knew that whenever I got there, he would be there. And then I woke up." And even just reading that, like, I almost don't know what about it, but like even just reading that, I almost just start feeling emotional again. But, we can guess that the fire represents goodness, like just goodness itself, and how they are riding and it's cold and it's dark. And so that can represent the world, right? Which is just cold and dark. And this recent experience with Chigurh, where this evil man just continues and he's succeeding and he's getting away with it. And so his father is in this barren world with him, carrying this fire, which could represent goodness. And he's riding ahead of Belle and getting the future ready for him to help it be a better place. But then the fact that he ends it with saying, "And I woke up," could represent the fact that this dream of a better place in the future is not going to exist. And it is just a dream. And that's why he wakes up. But then also, like, because his dad is dead, maybe this is a stretch, but it could also represent his father taking that light into the next life. And so maybe when Belle dies, then he will finally be in a better place, like literally, a place without evil. So I feel like, again, there's multiple ways you could interpret this. So it could be like kind of a downer in the sense that he's wishing for a better world in the future, but he knows it won't happen. Or is there a positive twist to this? Even the fact that him dying and the next life after this one will be a better place, I feel like that's a positive outlook. It involves you having to die, but if dying is just a progression of life, then, death isn't the end of the world anyway. So yeah, anyway, lots of different ways you could think about this. But yeah, I just love how the book and movie just end right there on that. And again, in book and movie, like, it just feels so emotional. And so, yeah, that is the end of the book and movie. So getting on to book versus movie. So again, this book and movie can be seen as having a very nihilistic approach to life. And Belle's actions don't seem to mean anything, right? Because he is always one step behind Moss and Chigurh, and Chigurh gets away in the end, and Moss and Carla Jean die, and especially poor Carla Jean, who literally did nothing wrong, right? And so it can be just kind of a downer of a story. And while that fatalistic, nihilistic view of the world isn't one that I share with Cormac McCarthy, if he's saying this is how he views things, which I don't know if he's saying this is how he thinks it is, but that's just the vibe of the book. Anyway, that's not a sentiment that I personally agree with, but at the same time, it was just so thought-provoking, right? And there's just so much to think about and so much to discuss, and it is so well written. And there is a part too with, like, speaking of the changing world, there's a part in both book and movie. It's said under different circumstances, but in both, Belle says that when people stop saying sir and ma'am, like, the world is going down the tube. And I do agree with that, because I think when we stop doing like the simple nice things for each other, before you know it, we're not doing the big nice things either, right? And the world is just getting more selfish and more cold-hearted. But again, not all change is bad. And in some ways, the world has improved in a lot of ways, obviously. So, but it's a mix. Some things have gotten worse, other things have gotten better. But anyway, when it comes to which one wins, book versus movie, this is like one of the most difficult ones I have ever done. Revolutionary Road was a recent one that I had such a hard time with. But yeah, I would be hard pressed to find anybody who read the book who saw this movie and didn't like it, right? Because it is such a faithful adaptation. So much of it is right from the book. And so they're just so incredibly similar, but they're also just so incredibly well done. And I've said this before and I'll say it again, but just because a movie is very similar to the book doesn't guarantee it's going to be good, right? So that does take skill to faithfully adapt a book and make it like just as good, especially for the book readers who know what's going to happen, right? But even though I knew it was going to happen based on the book, it was just so well done. So part of me wants to say the book because we get the war story with Belle and we also get the hitchhiker scene with Moss. But I'm trying to think if those scenes would even be as good in a movie. Like, maybe it's for the best that they left them out. I mean, I feel like the war story still could have been in the movie, but yeah, man, this is so tough. If I had like a partner I did this show with, one of us could say the movie, one of us could say the book, and it could be a tie, which would be perfect. But because I have to choose one or the other, I'm tempted to say the movie just because it can be a hard thing to faithfully adapt a book and make it this good. But at the same time, so much of what makes the movie good is right from the book because they took so much right out from there. And so it's so impressive. But I think I'm going to go with the book, actually. I'll say the book wins, but it's such a close call because the movie is fantastic. And again, it is one of the best adaptations that I have talked about here. I mean, there's been a number of adaptations that have been fantastic. Goodfellas is another one I come back to that as being a great adaptation. The Power of the Dog. The Kenneth Branagh Frankenstein movie I love. But anyway, yeah, I'm going to say the book wins because it is just so thought-provoking and it's so well written, and the movie is thought-provoking too, but a lot of the ideas, like all of the ideas from the movie, do come straight from the book. But anyway, I feel like I'm just repeating myself. Basically, both of them are fantastic and it's so hard to choose, so I'm saying the book wins, but honestly, at the end of the day, it is more of a tie in my mind. So anyway, thank you guys so much for watching this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, comment your thoughts down below. Again, this is one that have a lot of different perspectives, so I'm curious what you think of the book or the movie as far as the symbolism goes. Share this with your friends and family if you enjoyed it, and don't forget to give my podcast a rating and review because that really helps the podcast as well. And yeah, I will see you guys next time. Bye.